to this event on behalf of our brother Tarek. It is an honor to speak to all of you tonight. I read the verse of the Quran from Surah Al-Imran of the dominant non-Muslim society to prove that we are more like them, or less like us, or not like the bad Muslims, and much more like those that respect American values and their way of life, whatever these broad categorizations might mean. As a consequence, we therefore find ourselves confronted when we desire to express ourselves openly with explicit and implicit threats that more often than not, unfortunately, we allow to instill in us a compromise that selects silence and indifference where action and activism are more appropriate. Well, I would like to describe, inshallah, a little bit this evening some of the manifestations of this reality, about the way a culture of fear has been created, and how I believe Tarek Mehanna is being punished for refusing to submit to that culture of fear, and also what I think we, as a community, can and should do about it, inshallah. As the brother said on November the 11th, 2008, Tarek Mehanna, then a 27-year-old graduate of the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy with a doctorate degree, was pulled off a plane on his way to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where he was to engage in full-time employment, working for a hospital, having been the subject of brutal police harassment over the previous years. He was officially denied exit from the United States and was instead pulled off the plane and charged with the crime of lying to the FBI when questioned about whether he knowingly held a conversation with fellow Muslim Daniel Maldonado, a person that allegedly had moved to the Middle East without the aid of Tarek Mehanna, had then found his way to Somalia without the aid of Tarek Mehanna, where an indigenous Islamic group, the Islamic Courts Union, or the ICU, had come to power and implemented the first sign of safety and security the war-torn nation had experienced in approximately 20 years, as documented vividly by mainstream press, including BBC. These happenings in Somalia occurred as well, without the aid of Tarek Mehanna. Well, the security in Somalia would not last long. The ICU would soon be overthrown in a proxy invasion by Ethiopia, armed and supported by the United States, thus deeming them and anyone providing support to them terrorists, albeit terrorists that Tarek Mehanna himself had absolutely no direct connection to. Daniel Maldonado, on the other hand, as Ethiopia invaded, with its high new tech weaponry, a gift from its new U.S. ally, and as the U.S. parked a warship off the coast of the country, providing logistical and aerial backup to an attack that fits the definition of terrorism to a T, fled to neighboring Kenya, only to be arrested and charged for trading with a group on the U.S. terror list. Because Daniel Maldonado allegedly telephoned Tarek Mehanna out of the blue from Somalia, again without the request or foreknowledge of our brother Tarek, he would be charged with lying to the FBI for allegedly saying that he believed Maldonado was in Egypt, and, if these allegations are true, for attempting to protect his brother in faith from U.S. authorities notorious for terrorizing any and all individuals or political movements that come to power under paradigms different than their own. Tarek Mehanna was charged only after he refused to become an FBI informant and was given bail early then on the minor charge. However, as we heard, only months later, the FBI would again remove him from safety and security, this time from the comforts of his own home, in front of his own family, under allegations that he was planning to engage in terrorism himself, was involved in a conspiracy to attack civilians at a local mall with automatic weapons, and most recently that he was, quote, conspiring to provide material support to designated foreign terrorist organizations, namely Al-Qaeda, unquote. This, as we heard earlier, a result of his work translating documents from Arabic into English, mostly by ancient Islamic scholars that have been dead for centuries. During this ordeal, we have seen all too well how a case like Tarek's can be utilized to craft a culture of fear. The media was quick to highlight his praise for Al-Qaeda in recorded conversations, his alleged plan to attack civilians at a shopping mall, and his violent disregard for life. However, for anybody that knew Tarek Mehanna personally, it was apparent that this could simply not be the case. Tarek Mehanna was as active, speaking out against indiscriminate attacks against civilians, as he was against U.S. foreign policy generally, its occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, its unconditional support for Israel, its propping up of proxy dictators, and etc. Needless to say, none of these realities made it into the widespread press coverage, and for those that did not know anything about Tarek personally, it is very easy to understand how they could imagine that the allegations against him were true. Even in the Muslim community, independent and influential Muslim press played to the tune of the authorities. A very popular organization was quick to classify him a, quote, overzealous, angry, and impetuous youth, and quote, that it is not surprising that someone who openly revels in the actions of foreign terrorist groups and exudes happiness anytime something bad happens to the people of the land that he lives in will eventually come under suspicion and charged with some type of crime, regardless of whether he is actually guilty of that crime or not, unquote. The article was later removed, wisely. But it is an example of how far a climate of fear can come to create a culture which breeds inactivity. Inactivity more often than not proclaimed as seeking constructive dialogue, but in reality seeking appeasement and silence in the face of atrocity. Still, the evidence against Tarek even today is flimsy to say the least. The criminal complaint is full of testimony, predominantly from two cooperating witnesses, one of whom apparently agreed to work with authorities after incriminating himself in FBI interviews, and another, a convicted felon, facing at least 2.5 years in prison on a gun charge, at least until he agreed to utilize his friendship with Tarek to get out of trouble. The FBI called him the first significant cooperator who began assisting investigators at a critical time when, quote, our ability to use other evidence was uncertain, unquote. Thus, Tarek's trial will be dependent on the word of two individuals that were both themselves looking at prison time and the way out, along with some far-fetched fairy tales and accusations of intended violence, sandwiched between data and recorded conversations that show nothing more than that Tarek Mehanna was absolutely opposed to U.S. foreign policy, especially as it pertains to violating Muslims, but not that he was engaged in actually illegal activities. Our brother Tarek is not alone. There have been over 30 cases in the United States that have utilized the information of undercover informants as primary testimony in cases where the accusations were so severe, there is no way that plots could have even been pondered without the insertion of coercion or incitement by an informant that is not only pushing, prodding, and encouraging acts of violence, but is accessorizing, and more often than not supplying the logistics and supplies necessary for the engagement of such acts. In early 2007, for example, 24-year-old Pakistani immigrant Shahawar Mateen Siraj was sentenced to 30 years in prison for plotting to bomb the Herald Square subway station in downtown Manhattan. Siraj was set up by an undercover informant that pushed